Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, January 15th, 2021. The 1918 flu, the COVID crisis, and the FAIRtax. Now, most of us are not old enough to remember the personal and economic devastation caused by the 1918 flu epidemic. Now, this flu was caused by the H1N1 virus, and it's estimated to have infected over 500 million people, a third of the world's population at the time. In contrast to COVID-19, the mortality rate was high in children under 5 and in people between 20 and 40 years old. There were no vaccines and no antibiotics to treat bacterial infections that were associated with the 1918 flu infections. The most commonly used methods of slowing down the spread of the flu were disinfectants, isolation, quarantines, limitations of public gatherings, and they also wore masks. Now, government safety nets are much different today. Today, governments around the world are seeing greatly decreased revenues and greatly increased demand for services as they try to keep their populations and economies from collapsing. Now, let's look at the politician's solution. For most governments, the solution to any financial problem is to raise taxes, or if they can, mortgage the future of the country by borrowing money. In the U.S., this involves a combination of raising income taxes on corporations and individuals, creating new taxes like wealth taxes, and, of course, borrowing more money. The U.S. government uses sophisticated computer systems to predict how much revenue these higher taxes will raise, and the politicians then make decisions based on these predictions. Now, none of these computers are capable of predicting how people will react to the new tax policies. People distrust governments and are often motivated by the need to protect themselves and their families from having more of their money confiscated. Now, many politicians believe that people who don't just hand over their money are being selfish. However, most politicians don't want to offend anyone. And as long as the people will tolerate their increasing the national debt and using borrowed funds to distribute benefits to the people, politicians see this as the safest way to go. Now, politicians also know that most of their voters have to balance budgets and sense that there's something wrong with more debt. Therefore, they have to act like they're raising more money through higher taxes. The safest way for politicians to raise taxes is to promise that the increases are, quote, only on the wealthy. Now, since everybody knows that the wealthy have plenty of money, the politicians try to sell the idea that making the wealthy pay their fair share will solve all of our problems. Not only will the middle class not be affected by the higher taxes, everyone will benefit from the government having more money. Now, here's some interesting data from Bloomberg Wealth. The 50 richest people in the country are worth almost $2 trillion according to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index. That's up $339 billion from the beginning of 2020. They point out that if the U.S. government assessed a 5% wealth tax on this group of people, the government would receive an additional $100 billion in revenues. For example, Jeff Bezos has a reported net worth of $180 billion. Taking $9 billion of his wealth will still leave him with plenty of money for expensive meals and trips on his private jet. Now, $9 billion is a number that is incomprehensible to the rest of us, but it does make sense that if such a wealth tax were enacted, Mr. Bezos could still live quite comfortably on his remaining $171 billion. Of course, Mr. Bezos is not likely to just fork over $9 billion to the government without a fight. According to The Balance, the fiscal year 2020 federal budget outlines U.S. government revenue and spending from October 1st, 2019 through September 30th, 2020. The deficit over that time was $2 trillion more than the $1.8 trillion that was budgeted for. The president's budget planned to spend $4.79 trillion while taking in revenues of $3.71 trillion. The details below compare actual revenue, spending, and the deficit to the budget. It reveals how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the federal government's plans. If the government taxed the 50 wealthiest Americans at 100%, that is, taking every dime they have, it would raise $2 trillion. Now, that would reduce the deficit, but not eliminate it. So, what would happen next year? Would the government then try to confiscate all the wealth of the next 50 wealthiest Americans? In an article entitled, "It is Arithmetically Impossible to Fund the Progressive Agenda by Taxing the Rich," David Burton stated, "Data from the Internal Revenue Service Statistics of Income show that imposing a 100% flat tax with no zero bracket amount on those with incomes of $1 million or more would increase federal revenues by almost $986 billion annually. Thus, a policy of confiscating all of the earnings of those with incomes over $1 million would not even eliminate the federal deficit, currently about $1.1 trillion annually, let alone pay for proposed utopian progressive programs. This figure reflects taxation of all income, including the first $1 million, at 100%, and does not consider federal payroll taxes or state and local income, property, and sales taxes, approximately $106 billion worth already paid by this group. Confiscating all remaining after-tax income of those with incomes of $500,000 or more would increase federal revenues by about $1.4 trillion annually. Again, this assumes confiscation of their first $500,000 in earnings as well. Now, this would be enough to eliminate the federal deficit, but not much more. If, however, the federal government were to confiscate all remaining after-tax incomes of those earning $200,000 or more, that would increase federal revenues by $2.7 trillion annually. Now, as David points out, only the most naive bureaucrats and politicians would assume that this tactic of confiscating all income above $200,000 would provide the government with revenues for more than a year. In the real world, such a policy would quickly wind up generating absolutely nothing for the government. Who in their right mind is going to work for an income higher than $200,000 if the government's going to take everything above that threshold? It's like the farmer who saved enough seeds from his current crops to be able to plant next year's crops, but then suddenly decided to either sell or consume all of his seed. He may do well in the current year, but then he has nothing in the following years. In addition, what do you think this kind of confiscatory taxation is going to do to the tax evasion rate, which is already at $1 trillion a year? People with those kinds of incomes are not just going to obediently hand over their wealth. They're going to do everything they can, legally or otherwise, to protect what they have. Under such a tax policy, the government will steadily lose revenue until the paper money it's printing will no longer be supported by a productive economy, and at that point, it becomes worthless. Now let's look at the FAIRtax solution. No one disagrees that overcoming the effects caused by a government reaction to the pandemic is a huge problem. Many people and businesses can survive only if they receive assistance. The federal government will have to generate more revenue, either through more borrowing or by a combination of borrowing and higher taxes. All of us will have to be willing to contribute to the solution like we would in any crisis that threatens the very survival of our nation. Now, no one believes, though, that Congress won't carve out special exemptions for the constituencies that pay them with money or votes. The people instinctively know that Congress will be all too happy to leave the burden of the sacrifice on the rest of us. The present income payroll tax system is very divisive. It creates conflicts between groups of people that the politicians love. It produces a zero-sum game. It's not conducive to creating more wealth, but instead, existing wealth is taken from one group and given to another group. Regarding the FAIRtax, no one can dispute that the economy will grow much faster with the FAIRtax than with the present income payroll tax system, that more and higher paying jobs will be created, that Social Security and Medicare will be protected, that the FAIRtax will level the playing field between American manufacturers and foreign competitors in both the domestic and international markets. The prebate tax credit will ensure that lower income Americans are not harmed. The cost of doing business goes way down under the FAIRtax, resulting in lower prices for consumers. With the fair tax, evasion will be all but eliminated. If an extra subsidy or stimulus is needed in a crisis, it can easily be provided by increasing the amount of the monthly prebate. People will see on every retail receipt just how much the federal government is costing them, providing an incentive for Congress to keep those costs under control. And with the fair tax, people can be confident that everyone is paying their fair share and that Congress is not playing favorites by giving one group a break while penalizing another group. In conclusion, when people face a common enemy and know that everyone is making the necessary sacrifices to overcome that enemy, there is a united effort and the probability of success goes up. When the people face a common enemy but believe that certain privileged groups are being spared the need to sacrifice, there is no united effort and the probability of success goes down. With the fair tax, even if the rate has to be increased, we know that all of us are paying and the sacrifice is being spread to everyone. Those enjoying special privileges and exemptions under the current income tax will be paying the fair tax when they make purchases, and there's little that the politicians can promise them except more prosperity. Now, isn't it time that politicians were judged not by how well they shift the burden of funding the government from one group to another, but by how well all of the people are doing? As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the time is always right to do what is right. If you have friends who don't know about the fair tax, send them to FAIRtax.org. Have them watch the whiteboards under How It Works, and then, if they agree, ask them to please join us. And then contact your members of Congress and the President and demand that Congress pass the fair tax, the only truly fair tax.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the fair tax, and learn why the fair tax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.